I've always thought of myself as a practical man. The kind who goes to a library with a list, not for wandering. My professors said I had a single-mindedness that bordered on obsessive, but in truth, I just didn't like wasting time. That afternoon was no different. My bag was heavy with notes, my pen already uncapped, and in my mind there was just one goal: to borrow the book that had eluded me for weeks. A rare volume on Renaissance art criticism that no other library seemed to carry. The library itself was older than anything I'd ever studied. Its wooden doors groaned when I pushed them open, and the faint scent of dust, polish, and old paper rolled out like a wave. Inside, light spilled in warm puddles from hanging lamps, glowing softly against shelves that rose like towers. Every step across the creaking floorboards sounded too loud, as if I were intruding in a cathedral. The place wasn't busy. A couple of students hunched over laptops at distant tables. An elderly woman leafed through a gardening book, and in the far corner, a man in a cardigan dozed against the windowpane. It was a quiet world, tucked away from the rush outside. I made my way to the circulation desk, rehearsing in my head how I would ask for the book, polite to the point. But when I looked up, the words faltered. The man behind the desk wasn't at all what I expected. He wasn't a young part-time assistant or a board clerk. He was older, maybe mid-40s, with silver at his temples and a neatness about him that seemed deliberate. His shirt was pressed, his tie knotted just so, and his glasses caught the light when he lifted his head. "Can I help you?" he asked, voice low, almost melodic. "Yes." I cleared my throat. "I'm looking for a copy of Criticism and the Canvas. The 1947 edition. I was told you might have it." He didn't type my request into the computer immediately, as most librarians would. Instead, he studied me, not with impatience but with a kind of interest that made me feel like I'd said something revealing. His eyes, a calm shade of gray, lingered longer than they needed to. Then he nodded. "That's not a book many people ask for," he said, leaning back slightly. "What are you working on?" The question surprised me. Usually, clerks didn't care why I needed something, they just scanned the catalog. "A paper," I said, perhaps too quickly, "on the evolution of critique during the early modern period." He smiled faintly, as if the answer pleased him more than it should have. "Ambitious. I'll check for you." He rose from his chair, moving with a kind of quiet precision, and disappeared among the shelves. I stood there awkwardly, watching his figure retreat between the rows of books. He didn't seem in a hurry. His hand trailed along the spines as if reacquainting himself with old friends, until he finally pulled a volume free. When he returned, he set the book down gently, almost ceremoniously. "One copy," he said. "You're fortunate. It doesn't get requested often. Sometimes I wonder if it's been forgotten entirely." I smiled, reaching for it. "Thank you. I've been trying to track it down for weeks." He didn't let go immediately. His fingers rested on the cover for a beat too long, brushing against mine in a way that felt both accidental and deliberate. When he finally withdrew his hand, I thought I caught the ghost of a smirk. "Use it well," he murmured. "Books like this deserve readers who care." I chuckled lightly, uncomfortable with the sudden warmth crawling up my neck. "I'll do my best." I expected that to be the end of it. Polite exchange, nothing more. But as I turned to leave, he spoke again. "Do you study here often?" I glanced back, surprised. "Sometimes, when I need a quieter place than campus." "Good," he said simply, as though the answer mattered more than I realized. It's always nice to have people who notice the small things. The words hung in the air, vague and yet oddly personal. I nodded awkwardly and made my way toward an empty table, trying to shake the sensation of being observed. As I opened the book, though, I couldn't stop my eyes from wandering. He had returned to his seat at the desk, but instead of diving into paperwork or a screen, he was looking my way, not staring outright but watching, as if curious about how I handled the book, how I turned the pages. When I caught his gaze, he didn't look away quickly, as most people do. He held it, steady and calm, until I broke the connection first. I bent over the pages, pretending to concentrate, but my mind was scattered. Every rustle of paper from his desk, Every quiet movement drew my attention. Something about him unsettled me. Not in a threatening way, but in a way that felt charged, deliberate. By the time I left an hour later, I'd taken almost no notes. Instead, I carried the weight of his lingering stare, the memory of his hand brushing mine, and a spark of curiosity I couldn't quite extinguish. It was, after all, just a book. Just a librarian doing his job. That was what I told myself as I stepped out into the evening air. And yet, even as the doors closed behind me, I couldn't help but feel as though something had shifted, as though borrowing that book had opened not only its pages, but another story entirely. I didn't plan to return so soon. After all, I'd already borrowed the book I came for, and my notes would keep me busy for at least a week. But 2 days later, I found myself walking up the library steps again. I told myself it was because the quiet helped me focus, that my apartment walls felt too close, my desk too cluttered. But beneath those excuses pulsed something I didn't want to admit. Curiosity. I wanted to see if he'd be there. The doors groaned open the same way, the hush inside greeting me like a held breath. And there he was at the desk. Glasses perched low, a pen between his fingers. He looked up when I entered, and I could have sworn the faintest flicker of recognition crossed his face. Not the standard polite smile for a patron, but something softer, something that reached his eyes. I nodded, pretending not to notice, and chose a table halfway across the reading room. As I settled my books, I forced myself to focus, scribbling notes, tapping the margins with my pen. But after a while, I realized I wasn't alone at the table. A book had appeared beside me. Thick, leather-bound, the kind you could lose hours inside. I hadn't fetched it, and no one else sat nearby. When I turned, he was standing just behind me, hands tucked casually behind his back. "I thought you might like this," he said, voice low, as though we were already sharing a secret. It was a collection of Renaissance letters, beautifully translated, annotated with insights about the very period I was studying. I blinked. "How did you?" "You mentioned early modern critique," he said, cutting me off gently. "This volume pairs nicely with the book you borrowed." I ran a hand across the cover, surprised he'd remembered something so small. "That's thoughtful of you." He smiled, not broad, not obvious, but the kind that makes you wonder if there's more behind it. "Happy to help. Knowledge deserves to be shared with someone who cares." And just like that, he drifted away, as if he hadn't just dropped a stone into the still water of my concentration. For the next hour, I barely touched my own notes. I kept glancing at the book he'd given me, then at the desk where he sat. Every so often, his gaze lifted and met mine, holding it just long enough to leave me flustered before he returned to his papers. Was I imagining this? Was he simply being a diligent librarian, enthusiastic about helping a student? Or was there something else in the way his eyes lingered, the way his words curled around mine with too much weight? I told myself I was overthinking, and yet I came back again the next day. This pattern began without me realizing it. I'd step inside and almost immediately spot him, not because I sought him out, but because he seemed to appear wherever I was, browsing near the shelves where I stood, straightening stacks on the table next to mine, passing me a slip of paper with a note. "If you like Vasari, you should try this edition of Alberti." His handwriting was elegant, deliberate, the ink pressed firmly as though he wanted each word to last. Each time he handed me something, his fingers brushed mine. Too brief to call intentional, too frequent to be an accident. My chest would tighten, heat creeping up the back of my neck, and I'd bury my head in my notebook to disguise it. One evening, as the library thinned out and shadows lengthened across the floor, I was bent over my work when I realized he was beside me again. Close enough that I could smell the faint scent of old paper and cedar polish clinging to his clothes. "You should take breaks," he murmured. "Your hand must be cramping from all that writing." I looked up, startled at his proximity. His face was calm, eyes fixed on my notes, but the way he leaned just slightly toward me felt charged. "I'll be fine," I said, trying to sound nonchalant. "Still," he replied, his voice softer now, "it's easy to lose yourself here. Hours pass, and suddenly the world outside feels far away. Something in the way he said it made my pulse quicken, as if he wasn't just talking about the library. He lingered for a beat, then straightened, slipping another book onto the table with that same understated grace. "Try this one. It might surprise you." And then he was gone, leaving me staring at the cover like it held answers I wasn't ready to read. I started questioning myself. Every gesture seemed weighted. Every pause stretched too long. Was he simply generous with knowledge? Or was I reading into kindness what I wanted to see? My friends would laugh if I told them. A crush on a librarian? Really? Yet I couldn't deny how my thoughts kept circling back to him. The way his eyes held mine just a moment too long. The way his voice seemed to drop when he spoke to me, as though his words weren't meant for anyone else. One night, as I gathered my things, he walked past and said quietly, "You'll be back tomorrow, won't you?" It wasn't a command. It wasn't even quite a question. Just a quiet certainty, spoken as though he already knew the answer. I froze, books clutched against my chest. Maybe, if I have time." He gave a small smile, lips curving in a way that made my stomach twist. "Good. I'll have something set aside for you." Then he walked away, leaving me stunned in the half-dark room. Lying awake that night, I replayed every moment. The books left at my table, the brushed fingers, the lingering looks. Was he crossing a line? Or was I? Maybe it was all in my head, a lonely mind spinning coincidence into meaning. And yet, deep down, I knew. There was intent in his gestures, purpose in his pauses, a quiet gravity in the way he drew me back again and again. I told myself I'd stop going, that it was unprofessional, distracting, dangerous even. But the next day, as the afternoon sun dipped low, I found myself once again pushing open those groaning doors, heart pounding with an anticipation I refused to name. By then, the library had become less a place for study and more a place where I wandered in circles around my own uncertainty. Each visit left me unsettled, never quite knowing whether I was imagining things or stepping into something real. One evening, determined to reset the balance, I told myself I'd treat him like nothing more than what he was. A librarian doing his job. I would go in, ask for the rare book again, a second edition I needed to cross-check, and leave without lingering. No distractions, no wandering thoughts. I rehearsed the plan as I walked in, the heavy doors closing behind me with their familiar groan. He was there, of course, as though the building itself wouldn't function without him. The moment his eyes lifted to mine, my composure faltered. That subtle recognition, that warmth just beneath the surface, it was all still there. "Back again," he said, almost teasing. "Yes," I answered quickly, forcing a neutral tone. "I was hoping to see if you have the second edition of Criticism and the Canvas. I'd like to compare it with the first." He tapped his pen against the desk, tilting his head as though considering my request more carefully than necessary. "That edition is not available just yet." "Not available?" I frowned. "But it should be in the archives, shouldn't it?" He smiled, that faint, measured smile that always left me wondering what he wasn't saying. "Some things aren't ready to be given away immediately. You understand, I'm sure. Come back tomorrow. I'll make sure it's here for you. Tomorrow. Always tomorrow." For a moment, irritation pricked at me. What was this, a game? The book wasn't some rare jewel that needed polishing before it could be handled. It was either here or it wasn't. And the way he spoke, as though he were dangling it like a prize, unsettled me. Still, I nodded. "Fine. Tomorrow, then." His eyes held mine longer than they should have. "Tomorrow," he repeated, as though the word itself carried weight. I left without another word, but the heat in my chest didn't fade. On the walk home, I couldn't decide what angered me more. The possibility that he was playing some strange game, or the truth I didn't want to admit, that I already knew I would come back. That night, my thoughts wouldn't quiet. Why wait until tomorrow? What did he gain from making me return? From keeping me tethered to this place? The next afternoon, curiosity gnawed at me until I finally gave in. Instead of heading straight to his desk, I drifted through the aisles, running my fingers across spines, pretending to browse. My feet carried me almost on their own to the art section. And there it was. The book, the very one I had asked about, sitting right there on the shelf, unguarded, visible, waiting. I froze, staring at it as though it were a trap. My hand hovered before finally pulling it free. The cover was unmistakable. The second edition, not missing, not misplaced, not locked away in some archive. Just hidden. He had lied. The realization was like a spark in dry grass. A rush of heat surged through me. Anger, disbelief, confusion. But beneath it, to my shame, something else stirred too. Flattery. He had wanted me to come back. He had wanted to control the rhythm of our meetings, to make sure I returned when he asked. Why? My pulse quickened as I carried the book to my table. I sat, opened it, tried to read, but the words blurred. Across the room, I could feel him. I didn't even need to look. That strange awareness of his presence had become inescapable, as though he cast a shadow that reached me wherever I sat. Finally, I glanced up. He was watching. Not directly, not with the bluntness of someone caught staring. But his eyes slid toward me, then away, like a tide returning again and again no matter how hard it tried to disguise itself. Our gazes met. I held it this time. I wanted him to see that I knew, that his quiet trick hadn't gone unnoticed. For the briefest second, his lips curved. Not a grin, not even a smirk, just the faintest acknowledgement, as if to say, yes, I hid it, and yes, you came back, just as I knew you would. Heat rose in my throat, and I broke the connection first, burying myself in the book I could barely read. The hours dragged. My notes were messy, unfocused. Every few minutes I looked up, expecting him to be standing there, expecting some explanation that never came. He stayed at his desk, calm, composed, as if nothing at all had happened. By the time I packed my things, my chest was a storm. I wanted to march up to him, to demand why he'd lied, why he thought he had the right to pull me back like that. But another part of me, quieter, more treacherous, didn't want an answer. It wanted the mystery to linger, wanted the tension to stretch tighter. I left without a word. But outside, in the cool air, I paused on the steps. My hands clenched the strap of my bag, torn between anger and something dangerously close to excitement. He had lied. He had manipulated me. And yet, hadn't I been waiting for a reason to return? I told myself I wouldn't go back the next day, that I wouldn't play into his hands. I'd study at home, bury myself in my work, forget the curve of his smile and the weight of his gaze. But even as I said it, I knew the truth. The pull was already too strong. I would go back. I told myself I was walking back into the library for the books, that the questions waiting in my notes required resources I couldn't find anywhere else, that it was foolish, childish even, to avoid a place simply because of one man. But the moment the heavy doors sighed shut behind me and I caught the faint scent of paper and wood polish, I knew I wasn't being honest. It wasn't the shelves that drew me back. It was him. Always him. This time I didn't head straight for the desk. I drifted through the aisles instead, hoping to disappear into the silence before he noticed. Yet, as if conjured by my very thought, he appeared at the end of the row, a book balanced casually in his hand, that same faint smile on his lips. "You're back," he said. I could have answered curtly, reminded him I was here for study. Instead, I found myself shrugging, words softer than I intended. "Seems I can't stay away." His eyes flickered at that, a spark I pretended not to see. He stepped closer, setting the book on the nearest shelf. Perhaps that's not such a bad thing. Over the days that followed, our exchanges lengthened. What began as a quick recommendation of a volume grew into hour-long conversations between the shelves. At first, we spoke of safe things, philosophy, history, art. He had an opinion on everything, but never delivered them like lectures. Instead, his words invited me in, asked for my thoughts, challenged me in ways I wasn't used to. "You're too rigid in your analysis," he said one evening, eyes crinkling with amusement. Critics of that era weren't seeking absolute truth. They were flirting with ideas. Flirting? I raised a brow. Yes, he replied, voice dipping lower. With words, with art, with each other. Critique was a form of courtship. The way he said it made the air feel heavier. I laughed, though my throat was dry. That's one interpretation. Perhaps, he said, leaning slightly closer. But interpretations reveal more about the interpreter than the text. I had no reply to that, only the rapid beat of my pulse. It wasn't just what he said, but how he said it. Sometimes his voice trembled. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but I did. Other times, when I laughed at one of his dry remarks, his entire face lit up, brighter than I thought possible in that dim room. The sternness slipped away, replaced by something softer, almost vulnerable. I began to collect these moments the way some people collect keepsakes. A glance, a tremor, the quick curve of his lips. I told myself it was just observation, but the truth was harder. I was memorizing him. And then there were the touches. Always small, always deniable. A shoulder brushing mine as we leaned over the same open book. His hand passing me a volume, fingers resting just a moment too long against my palm. Once, as he reached to guide my attention to a passage, his sleeve brushed against my wrist, sending a shiver up my arm I tried desperately to hide. Each time I told myself it was nothing. Coincidence. Habit. But the excuses wore thinner by the day. The library itself transformed in my mind. It was no longer just a building filled with books. It became our private world. The shuffle of other patrons faded into background noise. The dim pools of lamplight seemed to exist only to cast us in their glow. When he spoke, the rest of the room disappeared, as if his voice rewrote the silence around us. I should have stopped. I knew that. Professors would have warned me about blurred boundaries. Friends would have shaken their heads at the foolishness of reading meaning into kindness. Yet there was a gravity between us, undeniable, pulling me closer no matter how often I reminded myself of the dangers. One evening, as closing time neared, I found myself lingering with him in the farthest row of shelves. The air was heavy with the scent of old bindings and dust. He held a book open, pointing to a line of text. I leaned closer to see, and our shoulders touched. Neither of us moved away. "Do you see?" he asked softly, his finger trailing beneath the words. I nodded, though I couldn't have repeated a single sentence from the page. All I could register was the warmth of his body beside mine, the way his breath stirred the air near my cheek. I should have stepped back. Instead, I leaned in just slightly, caught between the rational voice in my head and the undeniable pull in my chest. He noticed. Of course he noticed. His hand lingered on the page a fraction longer, then withdrew, but not before brushing against mine, the touch deliberate enough to make my heart trip. Silence filled the space between us, loud and fragile. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to break it. You seem to know exactly which books I need before I do. Maybe I just pay attention, he said, eyes searching mine. More than most. The weight of his gaze rooted me in place. For a heartbeat, it felt as though we stood on the edge of something vast, something neither of us dared name. Then he closed the book with a quiet thud, slipping it back onto the shelf. "That's enough for tonight," he murmured, retreating with a composure I envied. I stood there long after he left, pulse hammering, the echo of his words lingering in my ears. That night, lying awake, I turned the moments over and over in my head, the tremor in his voice, the way his eyes lit up when I laughed, the brush of his hand. They weren't accidents, they couldn't be, but admitting that meant admitting I was already caught in something I couldn't control. I should stop, I told myself again. I should draw the line, return to my notes, my studies, my safe little world untouched by gray eyes and lingering smiles. But the truth pressed in on me, undeniable as the shelves that leaned together over our whispered conversations. I didn't want to stop. The gravity was too strong, and every time I tried to step away, it only pulled me deeper. It was later than usual when I found myself still buried in my notes at the library. The lamps glowed with a golden haze, the silence deeper than usual, as if the walls themselves were settling into sleep. Most of the patrons had already drifted away, chairs left pushed out, forgotten jackets draped over the backs of seats. I should have gone home hours ago. My eyes burned from reading, and my wrist ached from scribbling. But I stayed, stubbornly clinging to the silence I'd come to depend on. Maybe, if I'm honest, I stayed because I knew he was still there too. The sound of measured footsteps pulled me from my thoughts. He appeared beside my table, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You're the last one," he said, glancing at the empty room. "Guess I lost track of time." "You often do." His eyes flicked to my scattered notes, then back to me. "Come with me for a moment. There's something I'd like to show you." I hesitated, startled by the sudden invitation. "Where?" "The back office," he said, voice low, almost conspiratorial. "Few people get to see it." The way he said it, not casual, not businesslike, left no room for refusal. My pulse quickened, but I nodded, closing my notebook and following him through the shadowed aisles. The office was small, tucked behind a narrow door I'd never noticed before. When he opened it, the faint smell of dust and leather washed over me. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with returns waiting to be reshelved, and the air was heavy with the quiet of secrets. He stepped inside first, holding the door for me. When I entered, the door clicked shut behind us, louder than it should have been. The sound seemed to lock us into a different world entirely. The room was dimly lit, a single lamp casting a pool of light across the desk. The clutter of books and papers gave the space a lived-in feel, nothing like the carefully ordered shelves outside. Here, the librarian wasn't the distant guardian of knowledge. He was a man with scattered piles, scribbled notes, and a chair that leaned slightly to one side. I swallowed, suddenly aware of how close the walls felt, how near he was. "This is where the hidden work happens," he said quietly, brushing dust from a stack of books. "Cataloging, repairing, deciding which stories get another chance." I nodded, unsure of what to say. My throat felt tight, my hands restless. He picked up one of the volumes and set it on the desk, his fingers grazing mine as he slid it toward me. "These came in today. Some are fragile. Handle them carefully." I reached for the book, but the air between us crackled. His hand lingered on the cover a beat too long, and when our fingers touched, neither of us moved. The silence stretched. The air felt heavy, filled with something unspoken that neither of us dared put into words. I looked up. He was watching me, not with the polite curiosity of a librarian, but with something sharper, something vulnerable and dangerous all at once. My breath caught. For a moment, time stopped. Then, slowly, deliberately, he leaned closer. The kiss wasn't sudden. It hovered in the space between us, a question neither of us had the courage to ask out loud. His lips brushed mine lightly, tentative, hesitant, as if testing whether the world would collapse under the weight of it. I froze, caught between instinct and desire, fear and longing. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might echo off the shelves. When he drew back a fraction, his eyes searched mine, gray and uncertain. I could have pulled away then. I could have laughed, brushed it off, pretended it never happened. But I didn't. Instead, I leaned in. The second kiss was different, deeper, hungrier. His hand found the side of my face, trembling slightly, while mine clutched the edge of the desk to steady myself. The taste of him was dizzying, the warmth overwhelming, and for a moment, nothing else existed. Not the books, not the world outside, only us in this fragile, forbidden cocoon. I don't know how long it lasted. A second? A lifetime? All I know is that when he pulled back abruptly, breath ragged, the silence that followed was deafening. "This shouldn't," he began, voice rough, but stopped himself. His hand dropped away, leaving my skin colder than I expected. He stepped back, shaking his head as if to clear it. I stood frozen, lips tingling, body trembling. Words failed me. What was there to say? That I had wanted it? That I hadn't known how much until now? That I was terrified of what it meant? He turned, running a hand through his hair. "You should go." The words stung more than I wanted to admit. But he was right. We had crossed a line we couldn't uncross. I gathered my things in silence, my hands unsteady. When he opened the door, the outside air felt colder, sharper, like waking from a dream. Neither of us spoke as I stepped out into the hallway. He closed the door behind me, the click of the latch echoing in my chest. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, replaying every detail. The dim light, the tremor in his voice, the way his lips had pressed against mine. Confusion battled with desire, guilt tangled with exhilaration. Shouldn't have happened. I knew that. He knew it too. And yet, the memory of it burned in me, impossible to ignore. I turned over, pressing my face into the pillow, trying to will the sensation away. But the more I tried, the stronger it became. The truth was unavoidable. I was consumed. I had come for books. I had found something else entirely. And now there was no going back. I didn't go back. Not the next day, not the day after. For a full week, I avoided the library like it carried a disease I couldn't risk catching again. First, it felt like the right choice. I drowned myself in work at my apartment, buried my desk in papers, stacked my notes high enough to wall myself off from memory. But every time I looked at the words in front of me, they blurred into something else. His eyes, his voice, the weight of his lips on mine. I tried telling myself it was nothing, a mistake, a lapse in judgment. People made them all the time. But the absence gnawed at me in a way mistakes shouldn't. My days felt hollow, stretched too wide, like I was missing a beat in the rhythm of my life. Even the silence of my room mocked me. Not the warm, golden silence of the library, but a cold emptiness. By the 7th day, I couldn't take it anymore. I told myself I'd go back just once, just to prove I could. I'd act normal, treat him like a stranger, and that would be the end of it. The doors groaned the same way they always had, and the smell of wood and paper wrapped around me like an embrace I didn't want to admit I'd missed. My chest tightened the moment I saw him at the desk. He looked no different. Shirt pressed, glasses perched, posture straight, but I felt the difference like a bruise under my skin. When his eyes lifted and met mine, there was no flicker, no spark, no acknowledgement of what had happened. Just a polite, professional smile. "Back again," he said evenly, as though I'd only been gone a day. "Yeah," I muttered, forcing my voice steady. "Needed to catch up on notes." He nodded, returning to his paperwork as if I were just another patron. The normalcy stung more than any open rejection could have. I found a table, spread my books, and tried to work. But the room felt too quiet, every rustle of paper too loud. My eyes kept darting back to him, searching for some sign beneath the mask. He gave me nothing. Hours passed like that, my notes filling with empty words. Finally, as I reached for a reference he'd set aside on the counter, his hand brushed mine. The contact was brief, but it snapped something in me. I froze. So did he. Our fingers lingered longer than they should have, neither of us moving away. The air thickened, pressing down on us. I pulled my hand back first, my voice sharper than I intended. "Are you playing some kind of game with me?" His head lifted, eyes steady. "No, because it feels like you are." I pressed, the words spilling before I could stop them. "The books, the looks, that kiss. And now you act like it never happened." His jaw tightened. For a moment he said nothing, and I thought he'd deny it outright. But then he sighed, shoulders slumping. "I'm not playing games." "Then what was it?" My voice cracked. Why did we?" He cut me off, quieter now, almost raw. "Because I couldn't help myself." The words hung between us, fragile and dangerous. I stared at him, my chest heaving. "You shouldn't have." "I know." His eyes flickered, gray and unsteady. "I've told myself that 1,000 times. That I should keep my distance. That I should be content with silence. But every time you walk through those doors, I forget how to pretend." My throat tightened. All week I'd imagined him cold, dismissive, untouched by what had happened. Hearing the tremor in his voice, seeing the strain in his face, shattered that illusion. "You think I haven't been trying?" I whispered. "I stayed away for a week. I thought if I cut myself off, it would fade. But it didn't. It's worse." His hand clenched against the desk, knuckles white. It's dangerous. For both of us. I know, I said, though my voice wavered. But pretending it isn't there doesn't make it go away. We stood there, caught in the pull of something too strong to deny. For a moment, neither of us spoke, afraid that naming it would make it real. Finally, he stepped closer, lowering his voice until it was barely a whisper. You unsettle me. The confession struck me like a blow. Not accusation, not rejection, but truth. You do the same to me, I admitted. Every time you look at me, I feel like I'm standing on the edge of something I don't know how to handle. His eyes softened, and for the first time, the walls around him cracked. I saw the vulnerability beneath the careful composure, the fear threaded with longing. This isn't simple, he murmured. No, I said. It's not, but it's real. The silence that followed was thick with everything we couldn't say aloud. I wanted to reach for him, to bridge the distance, but my hand stayed at my side. Some lines couldn't be crossed twice in the same breath. Instead, I whispered, So what now? He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again, steady but pained. We try to be careful. We try not to let this consume us. A bitter smile tugged at my lips. Too late. For a heartbeat, he almost smiled too, but it faltered into something sadder. We didn't touch again that evening. We didn't need to. The confession was enough, dangerous, yes, but undeniable. When I finally packed my things and left, the air outside felt heavy, as if the world itself had shifted. My heart was still racing, torn between fear and relief, but one truth echoed above all else. It wasn't just me. He felt it too, and that made it even harder to walk away. I had told myself 100 times that it had to stop, that the spark between us was dangerous, that indulging it would only end in regret. But the truth was, the more I resisted, the stronger it grew. Each visit left me restless, each conversation more charged than the last. Every brush of his hand against mine setting off a current I couldn't ignore. One evening, the weight of it all became unbearable. The library was nearly empty, only a few scattered students packing up their things. Shadows stretched across the shelves as the last of the daylight faded outside. I told myself I'd only stay a few minutes longer. But when I turned a corner and found him standing there, holding a stack of books that needed sorting, I knew I wouldn't leave anytime soon. You're late, he murmured, though his tone carried no reprimand. Had work, I replied, my voice low. But I couldn't stay away. The admission slipped out before I could stop it. His eyes met mine. Steady, unguarded, full of something we'd both been trying to hide. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The silence pressed down, heavy and expectant. Then, slowly, he set the books aside on a nearby table. I can't keep pretending, he said quietly. Neither can I. Those 4 words broke whatever fragile barrier we'd been clinging to. It happened between the shelves, the books rising around us like silent witnesses. He stepped closer and I didn't retreat. His hand brushed against mine, lingered, then slid upward, tentative but deliberate. My breath caught as his fingers grazed my wrist, a question asked without words. I answered by leaning in. Our lips met in a kiss that was hesitant at first, careful, as if we both feared the moment might shatter if we pressed too hard. But then the hesitation gave way to something deeper. His hand cupped the side of my face, drawing me closer, while mine found the fabric of his sleeve, clinging to the solidity of him. The world outside ceased to exist. There was no sound but the whisper of our breaths. No light but the dim glow filtering through the aisles. No reality beyond the warmth of his mouth and the strength of his touch. He pulled back only long enough to whisper, "Tell me if you want me to stop." I shook my head, unable to find words. So he kissed me again, longer, surer this time. We sank against the stacks of returned books, our bodies brushing, fitting together as if the space itself had been waiting for us. His hands roamed carefully, respectfully, tracing the shape of my shoulders, my back, my waist. Every touch was slow, deliberate, as though he was memorizing me the way I had memorized him in fleeting moments before. My own hands mirrored his, learning the lines of his body, the warmth beneath his shirt, the steady rise and fall of his breath. The closeness was overwhelming, intoxicating. The hush of the library seemed to fold tighter around us, wrapping us in secrecy. He pressed his forehead to mine, his voice barely audible. "I shouldn't. But you are," I whispered back. "And so am I." That was all the permission either of us needed. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't reckless. If anything, it was tender. Two people finally allowing themselves what they had been denying for too long. His lips found mine again and again, each kiss different. Searching, hungry, then soft, lingering. His hands explored but never pushed, guiding me, grounding me. I felt myself unravel in his arms, the walls I had built collapsing one by one. The library, once a place of study, had transformed into something else entirely. A sanctuary, a cocoon where the rest of the world couldn't reach us. The books stacked around us seemed almost symbolic, each one a story, each one a fragment of countless lives. And here we were, creating our own. Not written in ink, but in touches, whispers, breaths shared in the dim light. At one point, he pulled back just enough to look at me, his expression torn between awe and fear. "This is madness," he said softly. "Maybe," I replied, my voice trembling, "but it's ours." His lips curved into the faintest, most vulnerable smile I'd ever seen. Then he kissed me again, and the fear dissolved into something stronger. Time blurred. Minutes or hours could have passed. I couldn't tell. All I knew was the way my heart raced, the way his hand steadied me, the way I never wanted the moment to end. For once, I didn't think about tomorrow or about what was right or wrong. For once, I allowed myself to simply feel. When we finally pulled apart, breathless and flushed, we stood in silence, our foreheads resting together. His hand still held mine, fingers intertwined, as if letting go would undo everything. I searched for words, for something to name the storm inside me. All I managed was a whisper. "This isn't about a book anymore." His thumb brushed the back of my hand, gentle, steady. "No," he said, "it's about the story we're writing together." I walked home that night dazed, my lips still tingling, my body alive with memory. The city noise felt distant, muted, as though I were still wrapped in the hush of the library. I knew what we had done was dangerous. I knew the risks, and yet, for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel torn in two. Instead, I felt whole. And though fear lurked at the edges, I couldn't shake the certainty that whatever story we had begun, I wanted to see where it would go. The night after it happened, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt his lips against mine again, the press of his hand at the back of my neck, the way the world had fallen silent around us. I replayed it over and over, terrified it would fade into a dream if I didn't hold on tightly enough. And yet, underneath the thrill, fear gnawed at me. Was it real, or had the library cast a spell over us? Something that would dissolve the moment daylight poured in through its windows? What if he woke the next morning, regret sharper than longing, and locked the doors between us for good? By the time the sun rose, I had convinced myself that maybe it had been just that, a fantasy bound to the walls of that place, something fragile and temporary, never meant to survive outside its hush. Still, I went back. When I pushed the heavy doors open, my heart raced so hard it hurt. He was at the desk, as always, pen in hand, glasses slipping down his nose. For a moment he looked up at me, and I couldn't read his expression. Not rejection, not welcome, just something unreadable in the gray depths of his eyes. I swallowed my nerves and walked closer. "About last night." Before I could finish, he set his pen aside and leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "Every story begins with a first page," he said quietly. "This is ours." The tension in my chest cracked, replaced by a heat that spread through me in waves. He wasn't pulling away. He wasn't pretending it never happened. He was acknowledging it, naming it, binding it to something larger. I let out a shaky breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "Then, what happens next?" He smiled faintly, Not with certainty but with something better, hope. We write it. What followed wasn't some grand affair. There were no declarations shouted from rooftops, no bold claims made to the world. Instead, it was quieter. Small moments threaded between the silence of the library shelves. Sometimes it was a shared glance across the room, eyes locking for just a second too long. Sometimes it was his hand brushing mine as he passed me a book, fingers lingering just long enough to remind me of what we were hiding. Other times it was more. A stolen kiss in the dim back office, whispered words exchanged between stacks of forgotten volumes. His warmth pressed close to mine in corners no one else bothered to look. It was dangerous. It was fragile. And yet, it felt more real than anything I'd known before. The library became our secret world. The shelves weren't just shelves anymore. They were walls that sheltered us. The books weren't just books. They were silent witnesses, keeping our story safe between their covers. Even the dust and lamplight seemed different, casting everything in a glow that belonged to us alone. I started to see him differently, too. The meticulous man at the desk wasn't just the composed librarian everyone else saw. He was also the man whose voice sometimes trembled when he laughed, whose eyes softened when I entered, whose hand would curl ever so slightly when it found mine. The cracks in his armor made him human, and those glimpses of vulnerability pulled me closer than any polished mask ever could. One evening, as we sat together over a stack of returned books, I asked the question that had been haunting me. Do you think this will last? Or is it temporary? Something that only exists here? He paused, considering, then reached out and placed his hand over mine. His touch was warm, grounding. Does it matter? Of course it matters, I whispered. If this is just a passing thing, then maybe I'm fooling myself. He squeezed my hand gently. Maybe all stories are temporary, but that doesn't make them less true while they're being lived. And right now, this is true. Isn't that enough? I looked at him. The lines of his face softened in the lamplight, and I realized he was right. We didn't need to know the ending. All we needed was this page, this chapter, this moment. Yes, I said. It's enough. The days turned into weeks, and I found myself living two lives. To the world, I was still the diligent student, the researcher with ink-stained hands and a head full of notes. But inside the library, I was something else. Someone braver, someone freer, someone who had found a story worth living. Our relationship was a secret, yes, but it was also a sanctuary. Every stolen moment was a reminder that life could hold more than routine, more than expectations. That sometimes, the things we stumble into by accident, a hidden book, a lingering glance, a forbidden kiss, are the very things that change us most. Looking back, I know I walked into the library that first day only to borrow a book. I never expected anything more. But what I found was a story that belonged not to the shelves, not to the pages of any text, but to us. A story written not with ink, but with whispers. Not bound in leather, but in the fragile, burning space between two hearts. And if someday it ends, if the book closes, if the library empties, if the silence returns, I will still carry this truth. I borrowed a book, but I kept the librarian.